Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Odin's Movie Blog. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. And today we'll be talking about the Rise of Skywalker box office and what the numbers are looking like right now. What are the current estimates for the domestic totals? And what are we going to be expecting this film to top out at by the end of its run? And can we even get any sort of guesstimate to what the film will actually make by the end of its run? And the question, or rather the answer to that, is kind of a mixed yes. We can look at certain numbers and compare it to other films and get a general idea of where the film is currently tracking, but because there's so many unknown factors like what the actual estimates are going to be or what the actual totals are going to be for week 1 and week 2 in places like the UK and other places among the world, even though we have some pretty decent numbers right now for what the US estimates are going to look like, because of that unknown factor, it's very hard for us to be able to work out those percentages in that way, which is why I always wait for that second weekend drop-off, those second weekend totals, because from there, it usually is pretty good to be able to get some idea of what the minimum a film will make versus the maximum a film will make. And you can go ahead and check out my website, ombreviews.home.blog. Yeah, I know that's a mouthful, but I'm currently doing some box office tracking over there. And so you can see what my current estimates are, what the film has made, and also a couple of films that we actually have their end runs. You can see just how close the estimates were and how every single film so far that I put in there has been within the range of the estimates. Now, the range is very large because it kind of has to be when you're trying to project this type of film or any type of large budget film for a longer period of time, because there's so many factors that can change that. But I still think it's interesting nonetheless that we can actually look into this film right now, even with these early numbers, and get somewhat of an idea of where this film, a ballpark of where this film will likely end up. So we have here $193.7 million as of Saturday morning, according to Deadline, is what the current domestic estimate is. Now, what's interesting about this number specifically is that this is much lower than the early estimates had it. So the early estimates had it at one point between about $185 to $215 million, and that thing has been all over the place, and many people speculated, oh, it's going to get $200 million this weekend. It seems like that number is creeping lower and lower every single day. Even Disney's own official estimates came out and had the film saying, oh, it's going to make between 175 and 185. So it sounds like even Disney was starting to lose confidence in how much money this movie was going to make. And it could be for two reasons. One, they wanted to underestimate it so that way when the numbers came out, because they knew it was tracking better, oh yeah, it came in over expectation. Star Wars is doing great, because obviously why wouldn't a studio want to do that? Or it could honestly be that they just did not have as much confidence in it because of the very lackluster reviews, not just from critics, but also from a lot of fans of it as well. Because if we're going to break the film down from an objective standpoint, it is not a strong film. Again, to take aside my thoughts on Rian Johnson and Kathleen Kennedy, if you just look at this movie as a film, it is such a giant mess of a narrative that just doesn't work and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's why I can't wait for Mahler to do his objective breakdown of it, that it's really hard to sell this film. That's why I honestly think the week 1 to week 2 drop-off, even though we're in the Christmas season and even though it's going to bleed into the Christmas holiday, I don't think that's going to be enough to save this film from a giant drop-off. Again, probably in the 60s percentage-wise. Again, do we know what it's going to be? We honestly don't, because as I've been mentioning, there are a lot of different films coming out. There are a lot of different factors that could impact it. But what we have to work with right now are the numbers that we have right now, which is the 193.7 estimate. And this is the domestic total. So this is not worldwide total, but worldwide, it's not looking that great either. China, which has always been a giant moneymaker for most big budget franchises, except Star Wars. And I see a lot of people in the comments have been saying, well, it's never done well in Star Wars. It's never done well there in Star Wars. Star Wars has never done well in China. And they don't seem to listen to the fact that I say that in my videos, that it's never done well there. However, the problem is that it's been tracking lower and lower every single film. So it's not just that it's not a giant property in China, it's that every film, Chinese audiences get less and less interested in it. And in fact, I was looking at the numbers yesterday, and if you actually look to these numbers, for The Rise of Skywalker, right now, the current projection is for the film to make $17.8 million total. Now, I mentioned that in the video that I did the other day. But what is more interesting is how that lines up with what money this film made in China for Solo: A Star Wars Story, which was panned as a giant box office bust. It was a giant box office bust, lost $200 million at the box office, and how much money this film made overall. And when you look to that number, the Solo opening weekend, or rather the numbers for Solo, we have to go to, of course, unfortunately, the terrible boxofficemojo.com, because the numbers is still kind of just not quite there yet. But if you go ahead and look to the China numbers, you see that the entire gross in China was $16.4 million. So it made an entire total, a $9.7 million opening, $16.4 million total in China. So if you compare that to the 17.8 that this film, Rise of Skywalker, is set to make, there is a world where this film, Rise of Skywalker, with as much money that went into it as possible, makes less than Solo: A Star Wars Story, at least in China. Some people are going to try and say, but it's never done well in China, so it doesn't make a difference. But it does when you look at just how panned Solo was and how many audiences across the entire world rejected this film, not just China. And how this really just goes to show you not just that the Chinese have no interest in Star Wars, but also that Star Wars has not been doing anything to try and welcome in those Chinese audiences. And, some people might say, oh, yeah, well, they've tried to cast certain actors, and Rogue One did well because they casted Donnie Yen. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying to myself, no, that's complete nonsense, because every film in order has made less and less and less and less money. And you could see that trend continue with Rise of Skywalker, which I think is a pretty big deal, even though it is China. I don't care if it's just in China. The fact that this film is set to make less than Solo: A Star Wars Story when that film lost $200 million, I don't care what country it's in. That's not a good optic. That's not good. Now, it's more likely than not going to make more than Solo did in China, but still, the fact that it's even a possibility at this point in time, when they were having a lot higher estimates for China in the first place, is not good. It's not looking good for it. Now, is this film going to lose money? No. The film's not going to lose money based on these current numbers. Again, if we have a catastrophic week 2 drop-off, then we can talk about it, because this is a film that likely, with marketing, cost around $600 million to make, because we don't really have any metrics about what the production costs were, but seeing that The Last Jedi was around $308 million production budget before marketing, and that this film probably costs more already, and there's reports of reshoots that have been happening, and based on how much of a mess this film is, I would believe the fact that this would have reshoots in it is true. Then that means that the budget probably is closer to the $400 million mark. And when you take into account, multiply that by 1.5 to get that marketing cost added to it, you get to $600 million, which means the film needs to make $1 billion to break even. So based on the numbers that we have, at least from the domestic totals right now, what is the chance? What is the likelihood of that happening? So I did a little bit of the math for us. That way we have an idea. So as we all know, the movie itself has made, or is expected to make, around $193.7 million. Well, how does that compare to the other Star Wars movies in the Disney trilogy? Well, we have, of course, The Rise of Skywalker making the $193.7 million. The former film, The Last Jedi, made $220 million domestically, while The Force Awakens made $243 million domestically opening weekend. That film, of course, the first one went off to make over $2 billion worldwide. Then The Last Jedi ended up making $700 million less worldwide at $1.3 billion. And now this film is set to make less than that. So if we compare this to the last film, The Last Jedi, what is the difference between 193.7 and $220 million? When we look to those numbers, we see that there is a 12% drop. If these numbers hold, if the 193 holds, it means that will be 12% less money than what The Last Jedi made. And so if we take that number, and this is not a guarantee by any means, but it's all we have to work with right now. But if we take that percentage drop domestically and we apply it to the entire total, that would mean that the 12% less than the $1.3 billion that was made by The Last Jedi would put this film around $1.1 billion. Now, for those that have not been following me for a long time, you all know that my range right now on The Rise of Skywalker is between $850 and $1.1 billion, meaning I think it's definitely possible this film could cross $1 billion. But if these drops hold, not just in the US, but in other parts of the world, and it's consistent to around the 10 to 12% drop between films, then this number will likely stick out. We're already seeing the fact that China's box office is even higher of a drop-off between The Last Jedi and this film, because The Last Jedi made around $40 million in China and now is expected to only make 17. So it's not making as much money in China. It's likely not going to make as much money in other parts of the world. And we have now numbers that seem to confirm that it's definitely going to make less than Last Jedi, which means that we can use that and use common sense. And until we have the raw numbers, I'm not going to put anything confident out there. I'm not going to put any actual numbers or range that, as fully confident until we have these official totals. But it's looking more and more likely that this film is potentially going to barely cross the $1 billion mark and could potentially even not make $1 billion. Using common sense, if it's making less here, if it's making less in China, it's likely going to be making less in every other country in the market, including places like the UK, where it does very well, Australia, Germany, France, the European countries that have been showing up very strong for Star Wars in succession of the United States. It's going to be interesting to see how these numbers play out. Now, I'm already seeing a bunch of people trying to spin this saying, oh, Star Wars fatigue, patooey, $193.7 million is impressive. And it is. Again, for most films, this would be an incredible opening. For a Star Wars movie, you could even say this could be incredibly important, incredibly impressive. But not when you compare it to the others. Because when you start to compare it to the other films and the other films opening, it doesn't look nearly as impressive. You think about all the hype that they had for this film. You think about how all the shill media were going out to bat for this film before it came out. And then once it came out, they said, okay, we can't defend this anymore. And so now we have to finally be honest. But we're not going to blame the filmmakers. No. We're going to blame the fans. Even YouTubers have been blaming the fans for the reason why this film sucks. And at the end of the day, no, the only person to blame is J.J. Abrams because he made the film. And if you want to by extension blame anyone else, it would be Kathleen Kennedy, Rian Johnson, and Bob Iger, the ones that are actually in charge, the ones that actually have creative control over this process that made this monstrosity that we have in front of us. And if we're to understand and if we're to believe that this type of just mixed thought, which is very similar, again, reminds me a lot of what happened in The Last Jedi, and we think that that's not going to have any impact on that week 2 drop-off, I mean, honestly, there is a world where this film keeps making less and less and less. And remember, as I said previously, this film likely cost, with marketing, around $600 million. So if this film doesn't make this number right here, if this number comes in less by any percentage point, you're getting closer and closer to this film not making its money back. And if we ever get to the point where this film makes less than $1 billion, if this gets to that lower end that I have in my scale of 850 to 875, you're looking at a financial loss for a Star Wars film, and not just solo a Star Wars story, but for a major Star Wars film. We're not there yet. Okay, we're definitely not there yet, and I'm not trying to, build up the clickbait, everything nonsense. I'm just speaking honestly about the numbers that we have in front of us, comparing it to the films that we have previously, because that's all we can do right now. And once those numbers come in tomorrow, and of course next Sunday, which is to me the most important number, is what number we get next Sunday, because that percentage drop is going to determine whether or not we have on our hands another Star Wars success, a final Star Wars success in the theater. Because honestly, I don't think we're going to get another Star Wars film in theaters for a long time after this one. Or will we have ourselves another flop? What are your thoughts on this? Do you think the $1.14 billion sounds about right to you about what the film likely is going to make? And if these percentages hold internationally, it seems like that would be the case. We already know that percentage could be higher. It could be lower. It could have a higher showing and gross in certain countries. We already know it's showing much lower than the 12% that I mentioned in China. So as you can see, the numbers that I'm throwing out there aren't just coming out of thin air. They're not just being made up. It's being based on a very likely possibility based on the numbers that we have in front of us. So let me know your thoughts on that and all the things I talked about in the comment section below. If you like this video, smash that like button, give us a subscribe. It helps us a lot. You're all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful day. And as always, God bless.